Hi there, welcome to Help Solve the Case. I'm Christine Burke, and today we are talking about the Tyler Robinson Charlie Kirk case once again. And the reason for it is because we have been following some recent issues, precedents, and court decisions in our criminal justice system that started me thinking, and I wondered, are they going to affect this case? We're talking about the potential for the DNA to be hacked. I did a video about it. And we're talking about Smith v. Arizona, which talks about who's going to testify in a case. And I wanted to, I don't know, bring it up, ask you, what do you think? Is this going to be a problem? Is the defense thinking about it? How is it going to impact this case and all the other cases? Because I know many of you followed this case and we've got it currently going in the court system. Let's see what happens. Let's talk about it and let's see if it's applicable. Here we have our video from the East Idaho News that we're going to use. I'm going to play you some clips.
And just in general, what are your duties?
My duties are to manage a case. When a case comes into DNA casework unit, I will review any information associated with that case. I will review any evidence that is submitted for that case, determine which items of evidence need to be tested and which tests need to be performed. I will then create something called an exam plan. You can think of this like a to-do list to let the biologist know which items I need tested. Once that testing is complete, I will review all the data, draw conclusions in the form of a report, and then testify if needed.
Okay, remember, Bakker is the forensic examiner who ultimately reviews the data, reaches the conclusions, and testifies. But she just told us that she gives an exam plan to a biologist to perform the testing. And then once the testing is completed, she reviews the data. This distinction is going to become important once we start talking about Smith v. Arizona. But first, I want to establish what technology they were using.
And what your testing looks at is just the length.
Correct, yes.
Okay. Now, and is it also true that you're looking across many different locations?
Yes. So at the FBI laboratory, we use a kit called GlobalFiler, and this is looking at 21 different locations on a human's DNA, in addition to 3 sex-determining locations. That lets me know if an individual is biologically a male or a female.
Here's our first connection. She says that the FBI used the GlobalFiler in Tyler Robinson's testing, and GlobalFiler is an applied Biosystems Thermo Fisher forensic STR kit. Now, I want to be extremely careful here because this distinction matters. I am not in any way saying that there's a problem with the GlobalFiler chemistry itself. I am not even saying that there's a problem with this case. I'm just raising the question because we had the issue come up with the Thermo Fisher software applied to some of what sounded like these GlobalFiler systems. This newly disclosed cybersecurity issue concerns the integrity of the electronic data associated with certain of these systems. And GlobalFiler is the name on the bulletin, and she's just said GlobalFiler. What does that mean? It doesn't tell us which one generated Robinson's electronic DNA data or what software was used with it. I've gone through the video again now that this issue has come up. This issue just came up. I believe it was released on the 26th or 28th of July. It is now August 9th. This issue just came up. I thought about it. I went back and I cannot find which software system she used. They used. I even went to look at some of the photographs and trying to read some of the reports, but it raises a question because it's important when we hear her start to explain what the machine actually produces.
So you're looking at those, and what the machine produces are peaks.
Correct. Yes. They're just spikes on a graph, similarly spikes on a heart monitor.
So the machine is producing information that ultimately appears as peaks. Now watch what happens later in the testimony because the defense actually puts the electropherogram itself on the courtroom screen. And Bakker explains how we get from the DNA testing to this graph.
So explain to the is this an electropherogram?
Yes, this is an electropherogram. Each of those rectangles at the top, for example, D2S441, that is that small segment of DNA that I referred to earlier. And each of those peaks has a corresponding number that is the allele, so that corresponds to the number of repeats that an individual inherited.
And this is what you ultimately, after you get this electropherogram, not through running it through STR mix. There's a different device used to produce these electropherograms, right?
Correct. Yes. During the DNA process, this is the last step of that process. So what it's doing is so the DNA is found in the cells of our body. We're taking those cells, we're breaking them open with chemicals to release the DNA from those cells. We're making photocopies of those pieces of DNA so that we can essentially see them. And then the last step is to separate those pieces by size, and the ultimate output is this electropherogram.
This is the actual electropherogram shown in Tyler Robinson's hearing. And this is where I think people can misunderstand the new cybersecurity issue. The concern is not somebody hacking this picture on the courtroom monitor. The graph is the output. Underneath it is electronic information generated during the DNA testing process. In a very simplified form, they take the DNA sample, they amplify it, they use a genetic analyzer, electronic data comes out, it goes through the software, and it produces this electropherogram. And now listen very carefully to what Bakker says next about the relationship between the instrument and the software.
And is it true that you set the parameters for what the machine will pop up in terms of numbering the alleles?
Personally, I do not set that up. That was done during our validation of the chemicals and the software and the instrument that we utilize. But there are parameters so that the output of the DNA lets me know, for example, the different types of alleles, but that's not a parameter I set.
I want to make sure you answered that. You set, or your lab sets, what the machine does in terms of labeling particular alleles, correct?
Yes, that's part of the whole process and the validation. Yes.
So you could tell the machine, give me all the peaks at whatever level and label them as whatever the alleles are.
I see. So yes, so during our validation, we determine our thresholds, our analytical threshold and stochastic threshold that I mentioned before. The analytical threshold is a threshold that was determined during validation that we input into the software that I utilize. That says, for example, our analytical threshold is 150. Any peak that is 150 or greater, the software system will give me that allele call or that number for that peak. Any peak that's below that 150, the software system will not give me an allele call for it.
Even though it might be a true allele.
Correct, yes.
So you could say, and you referred to a measurement, you refer to that as RFUs, right?
Yes, that is the unit.
What is it?
It stands for relative fluorescent unit.
So in your lab, you tell the machine only label peaks that come above 150 RFU.
The software that utilizes the information from the machine, yes.
Okay. That correction is the part that caught my attention because the lawyer says you tell the machine, and Baker corrects him, and she says the software utilizes the information from the machine. So now, from the FBI analyst's testimony, we have an instrument generating information and then software utilizing that information. And that's where I think this newly disclosed Thermo Fisher issue becomes a fair question. Again, we're not talking about was the DNA, the personal DNA, hacked. We don't have any evidence of that. The question is, was the electronic DNA data in this case generated or handled by one of the instrument and software configurations affected by the newly disclosed vulnerability? And remember, we're not saying that anything happened in this vulnerability. Let's step aside from this case for a minute. We're not saying that anything happened to anything in this vulnerability. The key question for the defense in the cases, in my opinion, is you can't tell if something happened. So how do you know that something happened? Going back to our case here, our instant case, our present case with Tyler Robinson, did the FBI use instruments or software configurations, how they put it together, that were affected by this vulnerability? And if the answer is yes, is the defense going to ask questions like what analyzer was used? What's the software version? What original electronic files were generated? Were those files preserved? How was their integrity verified? Were they hashed, digitally signed, or otherwise protected against modification? Because this work was done before July 26th or July 28th, I'm just asking the question here because it applies to this case potentially and all the other cases. Did it affect this case? And so were there measures put, let me back up. Was the software configuration used in this case, the problematic configuration, we'll call it that? And if so, was it done before security measures were taken, before the patch or whatever you want to call it? And she's not mentioning anything like that. And the defense attorney is not asking questions like that. And again, we go back to it's a preliminary hearing. And so it's not the normal full load of defense questions and things like that. We just don't know. But I'm raising the question here. Now, we're going to pivot to the other case precedent legal challenge issue that we've been recently made aware of and we've been recently talking about. Smith, that case.
And the way your lab works, you're not the one that does all the different steps in the testing process, correct?
That is correct.
Other analysts have input that then all goes into the case file, which you have access to and rely upon in rendering your opinions.
That is correct, yes.
All right, there it is again. Baker doesn't perform every step, and other analysts' work becomes part of the case file she reviews, but she gives us even more detail in just a minute.
Let lay a more adequate foundation of the case file notes are assessed by you at every step of the analysis, correct?
Not necessarily at every step. Before I issue a report, before I write a report, I review all of the case notes. So that will be any communication log entries, any documentation from the laboratory, the biologists that perform the DNA testing. I will review all of that, write a report, and then give that to a technical reviewer. They will draw their own conclusions to determine if they agree with me. If they do, they will sign off, and then my report and my case file will go for an administrative review to make sure that the laboratory number is correct on all the pages. That if there's any crossouts, there's dates and initials and so forth. Those 2 reviews have to be done before I can actually make it a final report and case file that gets submitted and sent to the field.
This is where Smith v. Arizona enters the conversation. Now, Smith does not mean that every person who touched the evidence actually has to testify. But Smith, as we saw, does seem to restrict the prosecution from simply using one testifying expert as a conduit for statements made by another analyst when those statements are being used for their truth. They're talking about the reports and testimonial statements. Is Tyler Robinson's defense now going to challenge the integrity of the electronic DNA data? They may ask, who actually operated the analyzer? Who generated the original electronic file? Who knows which software version it was running? And who handled or transferred that file? Who can establish that the file Bakker here ultimately interpreted is the same data that originally came off the instrument? Bakker may be fully qualified to interpret the DNA, but that's not the question. The question may be whether she has the personal knowledge of those particular factual steps, right? Because now she's told us twice that other people performed parts of this lab work. We heard it in Lindsay Clancy. They call it batch processing. People were doing different things in batches, right? So maybe instead of somebody working one case straight through, people did different steps in the assembly line of the batch process. We don't know. If another analyst or biologist has to establish those facts through their own statements or records, then the defense may have to apply Smith. Do they have to confront Sixth Amendment clause? Do they have to bring all these witnesses on? Meaning, it may be because whether any particular lab statement is testimonial, and that's the legal language, does it have to be analyzed individually? This is what I'm going to watch for as the Tyler Robinson case moves forward. Does the newly disclosed Thermo Fisher applied biosystems integrity issue, vulnerability, whatever you want to call it, apply to the software and the machines used in this case? We can't answer it right now just because we heard GlobalFiler. We don't know it, but we would hope that the attorneys are aware of this issue and they're going to answer that. We need the actual instrumentation information and the software information. Now, number 2 is if the defense is going to challenge the integrity of those electronic data files or in any process, because different steps were used, who has the personal knowledge to be able to come in and make those statements? Now, I'm just saying, I know this is a very contested case and people are on all sides of the board here. First of all, we are on a preliminary hearing. I still have my cup here. preliminary hearing. We don't need the full cup. We just need a little of the cup. And we just don't have enough. We know they use the GlobalFiler. And the question to me is, does this affect the case? First of all, will the defense raise it? Are they aware of it? And then just in general, using Smith, will they apply that? Will we have to go through the process that we went through in the Lindsay Clancy case? Because that is still going, and it is a very tedious process. Does that mean that labs going forward will have, as I had mentioned in the other video, they will have to have specific people working the entire process to streamline it, so we only have to have the one person testify rather than all these cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. Thank you for being here. I love all your questions and comments, especially the nice ones, and I will see you on the next video.